Avenue, on that famous thoroughfare, with their noses in the air, high hats and colored collars, white spats and $15, spending every dime for a wonderful time. If you're blue and you don't know where to go to, why don't you go where Harlem flits, putting on the Ritz, spangled gowns upon the bevy of high browns from down the levee, all misfits, putting on the Ritz. That's where each and every Lulu Belle goes, every Thursday evening with her swell bows, rubbing elbows. Come with me and we'll attend their jubilee.
It's a Stephen Jones! So welcome everyone to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. My name is Christina Hamilton, the series director. Today we present a rare bird, a first ever milliner for the series, the inimitable Stephen Jones. And thank you to our partners for their support. Linda Dresner. Linda Dresner is a woman as well as a shop, for those of you who do not know, in Birmingham, Michigan. You should go. Design Core Detroit, and series partner Arts Engine. This day has been a long time in the making. Really, the work towards it started 8 years ago. I was a little shocked when I looked back in the notes and found that to be the true number, but it's true. And this 8 years of work to getting Stephen here speaks to the legacy of the series network, as our guest today comes through those who have graced the stage before. Zondra Rhodes and Andrew Logan are the first that we must thank. And then Andrew's sister, Janet Slee, who took me to dinner in London at some point, and where I met Susan Farmer, who then introduced me to Vicky Sarge, who is also here in the audience with us today from London. For those of you who don't know, Vicky is a designer as well. She's a jewelry designer. She has a shop in Covent Garden, so next time you're there, you must go. So this is proof to all of us: always build and always use your network. Yeah, get working. Couple of announcements. Tomorrow, if you're looking to start your weekend the right way, there is a trunk show with Stephen Jones and Vicky Sarge at Linda Dresner in Birmingham. This will be from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. tomorrow, so you should make your way there, and then you'll be all dolled up for the weekend. Then you can head downtown in Detroit if you would like to see Wit Artist in Residence. Our Wit Artist last year, Korean artist Joo Young Kim, is opening the work that she created here at the Stamp School last year, Wheon, White Garden with White Noise. This is an immersive installation which illuminates and honors the suffering and enduring spirit of the Korean comfort women who were forced into sex slavery during World War II. It's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful piece, hand-cast resin, and you should go see it. This opens tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. The opening reception will be from 6 to 8. It is at the Center Galleries at the College for Creative Studies, which is right behind the Detroit Institute of Art, so right downtown. We will be having a regular Q&A today, so if you want to meet Stephen and ask him questions, you can do so. We are not having it in here, however. It will be in the screening room. For those of you new to the building, you can exit these doors here into the lobby, go left down the long hallway, and you will find yourself in another lobby, and there's another little theater there. So we will convene there directly after the talk here. Today's a little crazy at the theater. You'll notice this when you exit. There's another show that is happening hard on our heels here tonight. So anyone who was here last week who took stationery and has letters that they've worked on and written for Penny, we weren't able to put up the table of the gratitude campaign because of this other show. However, I did manage to put the box for the letters. It's at the house manager's station if you did bring a letter to put in it. And we'll have the whole, big gratitude campaign table up next week. So yes, we're going to have a regular cue now. Oh, please do remember to turn off those cell phones. And now for just a little background on our guest, for those of you unknowing here, Stephen Jones, OBE, and for the students in the audience that don't know what that is Order of the British Empire. Stephen Jones is a leading British milliner based in London who's considered one of the world's most radical and important milliners. He is also one of the most prolific, having created hats for the catwalk shows of many leading fashion designers such as John Galliano, Marc Jacobs, Dior, and Vivienne Westwood. His work is known for its inventiveness and the high level of technical expertise with which he realizes his ideas. Coming of age during London's street fashion boom in the late 1970s, he first made a name for himself as an uncompromising style blazer. Can you imagine? He still is today. At the legendary Blitz nightclub. By 1980, he opened his first millinery salon in the heart of London's Covent Garden. These premises soon became a place of pilgrimage and patronage as everyone from rock stars to royalty, Boy George to Diana, Princess of Wales, identified Jones as the milliner. Nearly 40 years later, Jones continues to attract celebrity clientele. Actually, I don't know if you noticed, but the song mix that we played today hosted a lot of songs by folks whom Stephen has worked with, like Lady Gaga, who was on that track, and Madonna, and Boy George. Now, as ever, he's still at the forefront of fashion, showcasing hat collections. And you really should go to Wikipedia and just read through all of the names of all of the hat collections. My favorites are Hanging Gardens of Babylon, Passport to Pleasure, Room Service, Sunset on Suburbia, and Murder by Millinery. Those are just a few. Stephen Jones adds the exclamation mark to every fashion statement. So to begin with today, we're going to start with some process so we can all get up to Stephen's speed. We're going to start with a brief video of how to make a hat. So, oh God, that's so loud. Now that you all know how to make a hat, please welcome Mr. Stephen Jones to the stage.
I'm very sorry, but I have to take your hat from you.
Oh, I thought I could get away with it.
No. I just have to use this and put it over. You look great still. I just need to do some housekeeping. Anyway, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. It's my first time in Ann Arbor, and I came here to Detroit, actually, a few years ago. But I'm a milliner, and I live in London, and I'm here through my great friend Vicky Sarge, who is here helping on the slides somewhere. But I can't see a thing because the spotlights are so bright. Anyway, I think if we sort of go on to the first slide, and so I grew up in, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my journey and how I got here today, and I'm still making hats 40 years on. You know, when I was a little boy, I was growing up in the 60s, and I had and that's a photograph of me, basically still with the same knees, and a love of ice lollies, as we call them, and of hats. I really didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. I knew that I wanted to do something exciting, and probably I wanted to be an astronaut. The idea that I was going to make hats for mummy never crossed my mind. And I went to a very traditional boarding school in Liverpool. Where I grew up was basically on a sand dune in the middle of nowhere, or I thought it was in the middle of nowhere. And very close by was Liverpool, and I went to a boarding school there. And in fact, I showed these, there's a slideshow which will accompany my talk. In Liverpool, there are two cathedrals. There's one which is the Anglican Cathedral, which is the one far away in the photograph. And the one close by is the Roman Catholic Cathedral, which of course I thought looked like a sort of space station on the moon or something, it being early 60s. So of course I automatically loved that. But I think from a very early age, I realized there was something about design that was sort of extraordinary. I mean, in my family, we sort of communicated with drawing. Throughout my life, I always hoped that I would be an individual, but ultimately you can never reject your family's genetics. And my father had been an engineer, and probably would have been an artist if it hadn't been for the war, and he'd had a very different life. And we communicated by drawing in the same ways that musical families communicate through music, and mathematical families communicate through numbers, I guess. I was always so terrible at maths, I really don't know. I went to this place called Liverpool College, which was a very traditional boarding school. And this is me in my study when I was, 17 or something, with extraordinarily long 1970s hair. But the only saving thing, Grace, in the picture is there's a photograph of the band Roxy Music, top left. So I was attempting to be cool, even though I was wearing a school uniform. But I really still didn't know what I wanted to do. But I was good at art, and my elder sister had come down to London, and she'd been to a party and had seen, I had this idea that she was going out with Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones. I think she probably saw him from about 200 yards away, crossing the street or something like that, but I thought they were going to elope somewhere. So I thought that obviously I needed to follow her. So I decided that I wanted to go to college in central London. And I realized that I thought that Piccadilly Circus was the centre of London, and the college which was most closest to Piccadilly Circus was St Martin's School of Art, now Central St Martin's, which is a very famous art college. I applied there and to my complete amazement got in, and I got into the fashion course. There were only 4 courses in those days, and there was fine art, there was painting or sculpture, or there was graphics or fashion, and fashion for me sort of seemed to be the thing. But when I arrived, this was in 1976, and this is the era of punk, and that was a picture of me just beforehand as a punk on the extreme left there. And our group was called Pink Parts. That's why you were listening to some punk music on the way in tonight when you were walking in. But it was extraordinary. On my first day at college, I walked into this room. I mean, I was really from the back end of nowhere. I didn't know anybody. I'd never really been to London before. And it was this sort of slightly biblical division in the room, and I had to make a biblical turning, because on the left-hand side, there was all these very chic, elegant girls, all wearing beige cashmere, and of course smoking cigarettes very elegantly. Of course, this was the 70s, and the idea now that you could smoke in college is sort of ludicrous, but in those days everybody did. And it was an essential part of being a fashion student and being a total poser. And of course, I studied it very hard. I'm pleased to say I don't smoke anymore, but I used to. Anyway, they were on the left-hand side of the room, and most people were there. And on the right-hand side of the room, there were a few sort of miserable-looking punks who I thought, I mean, punk was slightly in the air, but I just thought, well, am I going to go left or am I going to go right? Am I going to be wearing beige cashmere or am I going to be wearing cheap vinyl? And I went towards the cheap vinyl side and thankfully never looked back. But of course, I'd arrived at college. I'd never done fashion or anything, and all these girls who, and there was only one other boy in the same year as me, and they could all make clothes fabulously. They'd all done sewing at school, and at my school, we'd learn to play rugby, and this ridiculous idea of sort of working in the Empire or something. It was this ridiculous, anachronistic place. So my tailoring tutor said to me, Stephen, you really need to get some extra help, because if you don't, you're going to fail the first year. And he had his own company as well. In fact, he had this very sort of grand couture house, and he came to teach us just because he believed in this sort of philanthropic activity. And I went as a tailor's apprentice. I was an intern. And in those days, I didn't know of anybody else from the fashion course who was an intern. I think that expression really hadn't been invented. So I arrived, and I was making coffee and picking up the pins and having an interesting time and observing what was going on. And, so often people say to me, oh, I hear about interns saying, oh, I was only doing the photocopying, or, oh, it was a bit like The Devil Wears Prada, oh, I was only getting coffee. But in fact, if you keep your eyes open, if any of you whose students are here, and I guess there's a lot of students here, when you are interns, it doesn't matter what you do, it's what you observe, which is the most fascinating thing. And I observed the machinations of an haute couture house, the politics of even 2 people working together, let alone 3 people. And even though my tailoring, the head of the tailoring workroom, Homer, was a fantastic tailor. When he was getting to an interesting part, I could sew on labels and sometimes put in linings, but when he was doing something like putting a sleeve in, he used to turn his back on me. And I thought that was ridiculous in my arrogance as an 18-year-old. Of course, what I didn't realize is that he actually kept his trade, and through, leaving Greece in the late 40s and coming to Britain, his trade actually had followed him and kept him and his family going. So, but I didn't really understand that then. And I realized, there was too many politics, but next to the tailoring workroom was a millinery workroom. And I mean, I liked hats, but what was so fascinating was the people who were actually working in there. You know, they were all ladies of a certain age, or I thought they were a certain age. I mean, they must have been at least 35. And, I mean, terrible. I mean, so embarrassing. But, you know, the fascism of an 18-year-old knows no bounds. And but they were great. They seemed to work hard, and they played hard, and they had a fantastic attitude to their work. And also I noticed there was a swing door on the workroom that they had a big pot of glue on the table. And I thought, oh, thank heavens for that. Hats are actually glued together, they're not sewn together. Little did I know there's much more handwork in a hat than almost in a dress. So I asked for a transfer from one department to another, and Shirley Hex, the head of the workroom, said to me, well, have you ever made a hat? And I said, well, no, I haven't. She said, well, how can I possibly take you on if you haven't made a hat? This was Friday afternoon. And she said, well, show me a hat on Monday morning, and I'll decide with Peter Crown, the owner. So, of course, I'm very much a yes person. I said, yes, 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 no problem. And left the room and thought, hell, what am I going to do? So I went back to my parents' house, and I thought, well, I'll make some sort of pillbox. So I got an old packet of cereal and took the cardboard from that and some glue, and I begged my sister for some fabric, and she gave me an old blouse. And this that you're looking at the moment is the result. Which amazingly, I have this photograph, which was taken a few years later. The funny thing about this is the flowers on it. Now, I'm sure none of you were growing up in Britain in the 1960s, but the extraordinary thing is, if you bought petrol, i.e. gas, at a garage in the 60s in Britain, if you were a man, they gave you as a free gift a whiskey tumbler. Can you imagine that happening now, like drinking and driving? It's such the wrong message. And if you were a girl, I mean, talk about gender fluidity, absolutely did not exist then. They gave you some plastic flowers. And my mother had held on to some of these plastic flowers. Actually, they were the sort of plastic that obviously we hear about in the oceans, because long after we're all dust, those plastic flowers will look exactly the same. And these are some of them, and they actually got put to good use. So I sewed them onto the hat, showed them on the Monday morning to Shirley Hex, and she thought, in fact, the fact that this hat was trimmed with plastic flowers was very punk and very modern. I didn't know that flowers on hats were supposed to be made out of silk, because of course plastic weighs a ton. Anyway, that was the beginning of something, and it became sort of my extra subject at college. But of course I was still doing women's fashion, and this is an outfit from my final collection. At the same time as I was at college, I was also going to nightclubs, and I'd met various people in this place called the Blitz Club, and there was Boy George and Kim Bone you just saw before, and I met this guy called Steve Strange. Now this was 1980, and he was very, very strict about who he let in. You had to look the part, and famously Mick Jagger was not allowed in one day because I think he probably looked at least 35, but anyway, Steve was the man on the door, and he actually had a hand mirror and would say to the people, would you let you in? So non-PC, but it's quite wonderful. And I mean, fortunately, I had some friends in right places who took me in, but quickly I learnt the ropes. And this is me dancing in the Blitz nightclub. I'm the one on the right with a hat on, funnily enough. And I started to make hats for friends. And that was actually one of the things that, you know, for example, if you look at the hats that I have here, they're all smallish hats. And yes, sometimes I do make hats, but, you know, I had to make hats that my friends could dance in. And you can't dance in a big brim. You had to dance in a cocktail hat. So that's why I always made hats which are slightly smaller. So Steve Strange, who was the entrepreneur from the club, had a day job as well. And in a funny way, I do lots of things. So I have a day job and I have an evening job. My day job is running my own company in London, and my evening job is I work for Christian Dior in Paris. And I think my Saturday paper round is curating exhibitions. So I'm always very, very busy, which is why it took me 8 years to get me here. This is a sketch from the first collection, but within a year of leaving college, amazingly enough, I had my own little shop. And this was it. And we opened on the 1st of October, 1980, and some friends of mine had done the invitation list, and literally the shop was about the size of this lectern, and we'd invited 250 people. And my poor suffering parents bought me a case of white wine and said, well, we hope that they bought it in the afternoon. They actually didn't come to the evening. They left very early before the throngs arrived. But fortunately, just down the road was a pub, and it was a nice autumn day, so everybody sort of attempted to even get down the road. There were so many people. The road was completely blocked. They couldn't even get into the shop. And we had a huge, very successful opening. So that's the first message. It's not as though I've come to preach to you or anything, but always, if you're in art and design, when you leave college, or even when you are at college, it's not because you want to do it yourself, it's because your friends believe in you, and together you can do something. You know, people often imagine that designers have this fantastic idea that they're incredibly motivated by and very strong about. But so often, a creative idea is this tiny, tiny little thing that you're actually very unsure of. And your friends can help to bolster your confidence and sort of take you out and show you a good time, make you relax, and help you understand the world and communicate to everybody else. So slowly but surely, I had my own little shop, and I started to, and this was actually one of my business cards that I had. You see, I had grand ambitions that I would have offices around the world. The fact that I only had one employee at that time, and that was an intern, Bauker, was nothing to do with it. I mean, I remember I saying to a designer, Ralph Simmons, who was the designer at Dior a few years ago, he's since left, he went to Calvin Klein, and now he's doing his own thing. There was some hat which wasn't quite working, and I said, oh, don't worry, I can push the volume around the back and stitch it underneath and nobody will see. And he said, but I really want the hats to be honest and the truth. And I said, oh, but hats are all about the fabulous lie. It's all fake. And that's what I love about it. So anyway, this is a photograph of me, and I was starting to get publicity in Vogue and meeting various people, because also it's true that if you stay at home, you're never going to make it. You have to go out and network as much as possible. And of course, the great thing is now, for me, networking was networking within London. With the internet now, you can network throughout the world. The world really is your oyster. And socially, through Andrew Logan, who was really one of my mentors when I first started, I met the fabulous and zany Zandra Rhodes. And this is a hat I made for her, and she was my first ever designer client. Because I do my own thing, but I also work with other people as well. I think if you're a milliner, and if you're a designer, not to say you have to take everything that comes along to you, but you have to be diverse as possible. You have to try lots of different things. For example, if you say, oh yes, I'm a jewelry designer, well, why couldn't you design a house? If you're an architect, why couldn't you design a perfume bottle? It's all the same thing. It's proportion, texture, color, an understanding of the fashions of those things, because architecture and everything else is completely about fashion as well. This was a hat I made for Jasper Conran, and I started to get a clientele. I'd had the shop, and then I moved to this little workroom, and one day with Jasper, he'd phoned me up and said he had a very important client for me to see. So I went to his showroom, and I opened the door, and in the fitting room, I went in, and to my complete amazement was Diana, Princess of Wales, who was without question the most famous person in the world at that point. And I said, good afternoon, Your Royal Highness. And I said, oh, where's Jasper? And I heard, I'm here. And she had a ball gown on, and Jasper suddenly appeared from under the ball gown where he'd been sort of pulling her petticoats. Anyway, and I knew her at the beginning, really, of her reign. I'll tell you a funny anecdote. I once went for a fitting, and often I made hats which were for her private life as well as her official function. This is actually when she was launching a ship, I think. So I went into her, not into her bedroom, but into an anteroom to her bedroom, and we were trying various hats on. And there was one hat with a veil. And at that particular point, the nanny brought in her two very young sons. And the younger of the two picked up my box of pins, which was on a sofa, and sort of threw them up on the air. And I realized that all these pins tinkling down, sort of falling into the hair and across the face of the future King of England. And of course, that's Prince William now and Prince Harry. So I knew them when they were very young. And fortunately, they still do have their eyesight, but nothing to do with me. The next picture is another crown, the royal thing that I worked on. For those of you who know fashion, this is the tweed crown I made for Vivienne Westwood very many years ago. So it's interesting. When Christine was introducing me, she talked about rock stars to royalty. So this has always been the sort of strange polarity of my job that, yes, I do make hats for Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, but I make hats for Rihanna. And this was a hat that I made for Boy George very early on. I knew him really even before he was a singer. And he was a great client. And a funny story, the next picture is from a still from the video, Do You Really Want to Hurt Me? I was in this video, funnily enough, wearing a three-piece suit and a shirt and tie, not far unlike today, even though I was much younger then. And George they'd released very many singles from the first album, but in fact none of them had charted, and everybody apart from George did not like this single and thought it was very sort of soppy and weak, but in fact it went to #1 in about 40 countries around the world. But Jean-Paul Gaultier, the designer in Paris, saw me in this video and in fact based his first men's collection on me. And this is a hat that I did from the men's and the women's collection, which was a mask which was loosely based on a fez. And we started to work together, and this is my entree into Paris. Now, I'll tell you just a very brief story how things can happen. It's just like keep your eyes open. People always say to me, you're very ambitious. In a way, no, I'm not. I just take what life throws at me and try and make a hat out of it. Actually, I've never said that before, but I need to... Vicky, could you write that down, please? Because otherwise I'll forget it. So I went to see Jean-Paul. He'd asked me to model in his men's show, and I'd actually fallen off my brother-in-law's motorbike and sort of twisted my ankle badly. And I couldn't be in the show. But a few months later, I went to Paris with my assistant, Sibylle. And this was even pre-video, it was so long ago. I mean, literally Flintstones era. And they had a projectionist, and they showed me the film of the men's show, and he said to me, well, would you be interested in working with me? Would you be interested in doing some hats for the women's show? And I sort of said, yes. And he said, well, I'm going out for lunch now. I'll be back in about an hour and a half. If you could prepare some designs, I'll have a look at them when I come back. And I used to agonize for a week over one design. But I went out and went to a stationer's and bought a little pad of paper and just sketched and sketched and sketched. And for all of you I know who are designers, there is that fear of the piece of white paper or the new file that you're creating within Excel or within Photoshop or whatever you're doing. And it's that white thing, and you have to get over yourself to do it. And that's why, even for me now, when I have to design a new collection, my house is completely immaculate. Everything is so organized, because I will use everything to avoid starting on the new collection. And I'm 62 years old now, and it still doesn't change. And I think if you asked any I mean, I don't know if any designers in history were the same. I don't know, if Michelangelo, when he was painting the roof of the Sistine Chapel, whether he prevaricated in the way that I do now. But I think somehow we always try and put it off. Anyway, the great thing about that is I had an hour and a half, and I just had to damn well get on with it. And I did sketch after sketch after sketch, and they became sort of part of fashion history. This is me, the season afterwards. Slides are still picking around. This is me the season afterwards. Always backstage, I have a big tray, which I move the hats around in. And unbeknown to me, Jean-Paul had sort of something planned. So he gave me one of the trays and he said, I want you to go out on the runway. I said, what do you mean? And he said, go out there now. And he sort of pushed me through the curtains, and suddenly I was on a fashion show runway. I mean, I had no idea what was happening. And, I hadn't been to bed for 3 days, and I thought my fly was undone, and, it was all a mess. Anyway, he'd taken all the girls told all the girls to take their hats off and put them in the big tray in front of them. And so that's how it was sort of my entree to Paris. So what I was saying, it's not what you do, it's how other people can help you as well. It's just being part of a team. And this was an extraordinary time in Paris, and this is Keith Haring and Patrick Cox and Boy George and myself. I look rather sheepish. That's before we tried to escape without paying the bill. But I started to work with other people as well. This was Iman wearing a hat I made for Thierry Mugler, the designer. This is a huge show, and she really showed me sort of how to do it. And I started to work with Claude Montana. These are designers who were very big in the late 70s and worked throughout the 80s. And I worked with all sorts of different people, but I was loving Paris. For me, I wanted the world to be sort of a united place. I was a firm believer in the European Union in this time of Brexit, this crazy thing that we're going through. It's a total nightmare for me because I know why the EU was created, and I was very proud to be European. I wasn't only proud to be British, but proud to be European. But there was something, even though I'd sort of, in a slight way, rejected my British past in order to move on to the next thing, there was something about about Britishness that I was really aware of, but you had to move away in order to see it. And I met up with John Galliano. I'd met him years and years before. He'd asked me to do hats for his final college show, and in the John Galliano book, it says that he asked me this on the dance floor of the Blitz, and apparently I said, "Not on your life, darling." But I have no memory of this whatsoever. I think I was slightly under the influence of cheap alcohol. So anyway, I started to work with John, and we made some extraordinary hats together. This is a Thunderbird made from popsicle sticks, and of course this was in the many, many years before we were aware of cultural appropriation and the issues surrounding that. But this was a hat which was inspired by Picasso, made out of stitched straw. We made all sorts of different fantasies, and sometimes hats were big and sometimes hats were small. This was a hat, this big spiral, made from ostrich spines. They're actually the spines of the feathers, so if you trim the fluffy bits off either side of the feather, you're sort of left with this tapering stick, which is incredibly light, and this beautiful photograph taken by Michael Roberts is one of those. This was a hat with pleating and veiling, and with John there was always this idea of great romance. I've worked with him for 25 years now, and one day it was announced that he was going to become the designer at Givenchy. Givenchy, the very grand haute couture house, and we walked in there and it was extraordinary. From being sort of a minor dressmaking house to sort of, what was the equivalent here? I don't know. We went from being a tiny Ford to being a Cadillac overnight. And this was a hat that I made for him from the first collection. But we'd only been there a year, and it was announced, because we always looked over our shoulder and we saw the house of Dior, and Dior and Chanel are the biggest haute couture houses in the world, and Dior and Givenchy are part of the same group, LVMH. And we always looked over our shoulder. They had much more money, much more resources, bigger workrooms, etc. And Gianfranco Ferre, the designer there, was sort of let go from his contract. That's the polite way of saying it. And Women's Wear Daily phoned me up and they said, well, who do you think should be the next designer there? And I said, oh, Jean-Paul Gaultier. And I hadn't heard anything about this at all. And then later on in the day, it was announced that John Galliano was going to be taken over at Dior, was going to take over at Dior. And this was a hat from the first collection. I remember my first day at Dior. It was extraordinary. I mean, as I said at the very beginning, I come from a tiny little town. Basically, my great-grandfather built houses on this sand dune sticking out of the coast of England in a very, very cold, freezing, wet place. And suddenly, I was walking into Dior, walking up the grey carpet in this marble hall with beautiful chandeliers. And on the walls, there were photographs of Marlene Dietrich and Ava Gardner, all the great stars of yesteryear. And I was there. It was really like being in the vortex of the fashion world. And for all of you doing different areas of design, there's always an absolute vortex of a particular world, whether it's, you know, architecture or ceramics or car design or whatever. And this is another hat from the first collection. And that was in 1996. And I am still working at Dior after many years, and I do the women's collections, the men's collections, and the babies' collections. And it's extraordinary to think that this darling little child is going to have a handmade hat, but some do. Of course, when you're making hats for the runway, you're not making hats to dance in a nightclub, or hats like from my own collection, and all of these are hats from my own collection, which are about being the right scale for having over a lunch table or a dinner table or a cocktail party. These are to be seen in a fashion show. So, I mean, literally something the size of this theatre. So that's why sometimes we do hats which are huge, like this particular one. But sometimes we do some hats which are very small and powerful. Now, I've worked with different designers at Dior for very many years. I worked with John, and then Ralph Simmons, and now work with Maria Grazia. And this is a mask in pleated tulle that I made for a fashion show in Shanghai about a year ago. I travel all over the world. That's why it took 8 years to get me. If you're a milliner, you have to go to them. If you're a dress designer, everybody comes to you. So I literally am at Heathrow Airport in London every week, or taking the train to Paris every week. But what is great is the variety. So I do my own thing in London, and then I go to Paris and I work with Dior. And I go to New York and work with other designers too. This is another hat for Maria Grazia, and this is the winter publicity campaign featuring hats. And the next picture is a hat that we showed, actually, exactly a week ago. This was a patchwork straw hat that we showed in Paris a week ago. So I said that I worked with Dior Man, and this is from the current campaign. And the next hat is made with a collaboration with the New York artist Daniel Arsham. And you can see this is almost like a baseball cap or a baseball visor, and it's been eaten away and embroidered and with crystals in it. The great thing about millinery is that it doesn't need to be boil wash. You can make hats out of anything. You can make hats out of paper, out of metal, out of wire. A hat can be the ultimate fantasy. Sometimes people say to me, well, you did fashion at college, why don't you carry on and do women's fashion now? And I'd always harbored that idea. In fact, when I first left college, I did make some clothes. That was until I worked with John Galliano, and I realized that he could make design clothes better than me. And I think if you're a designer, you have to believe, maybe stupidly, but you have to get yourself into the mental headspace that you are going to be the best in the world. Because if you can't imagine that you're the best in the world, it's so tough to do what we do. And if it's at 4 o'clock in the morning and you're unpicking that seam because you don't like it anymore, or you're redoing that drawing because you don't like it anymore, you have to absolutely love it, almost more than life itself, in order to do it. You have to be completely passionate about it. And that's why you need your friends to say, come on, let's go out for a drink, it's only a hat. I can't tell you that balance is very difficult to get. So I worked not only with Dior, but this is me with Comme des Garçons in 1985, I think it says on 1985, yes. And this is also from the 80s, and working with Rei Kawakubo, the way that I met her, it was, I wonder how we're doing for time. I think we're doing okay. Yeah. The way that I met Ray was, I actually met her in Anchorage Airport. Many, many years ago, you couldn't actually fly direct from Europe to Japan. And we met in the duty-free in Anchorage Airport, and she came up to me and said, Stephen Jones, I like your hats. And I thought she was sort of a possible client or a fan or something. I didn't really realize. And I said, oh, thank you very much, and walked away. And she came over to me twice after that saying, Stephen Jones, I really like your hats. I didn't realize, of course, she didn't really speak English, and she'd been really sort of practicing this statement. But anyway, she forgave me my complete British arrogance of the English language. And we worked together ever since. And we do all sorts of different things. We work on men's shows, women's shows. These are some hats. This was an illuminated hat. And also they make, I make a fragrance, and she makes my fragrance for me. And there's a place called Dover Street Market, and there's Dover Street Markets around the world. And I sell hats in her shop. But also I've worked with different people. I worked with, this is a hat made from peacock, extraordinarily enough. And this was for Louis Vuitton with Marc Jacobs, the American designer. And this is a fantastic hat coming up for Walter van Beirendonck. So this is made from wood. So within my workrooms, I have extraordinary experts. I don't make everything myself. I make some hats myself, but it's really a great team. And I have a whole series of different collaborators who can work in fabric, of course, in metal, in wood, in textiles, in plastics. Sometimes people say to me, you know, do you love using new materials? Well, yes, I do. And for example, this hat is made from cast resin. But if you want the most perfect black, there is nothing more beautiful than black velvet. If you want the most perfect white, there's nothing better than white cotton. But of course, new materials can sometimes look very spectacular. This is a ghost, for those of you who don't know, from Pac-Man. I was very happy to see some graffiti outside the back of the theatre, which was Pac-Man's going along, trying to eat ghosts. And I work with Giles Deacon in London, and I still make many celebrity hats too. This is the bridal veil I made for Pippa Middleton last year for her wedding. And oops, a fashion show. This is a fashion show on the Queen Mary that I did earlier in the year. Sailing from New York to Southampton. That was a very little brief clip there. But hats can be so many different things. These are some of the crazy hats made. These were hats made with balloons in the previous one, this one, and I love this. I'd been planning this hat for maybe 20 years. The thing is that when you're a milliner, you're always working against gravity. So I thought, well, if we could make this giant volume but made from helium balloons. So these were helium balloons put into like a net bag. But you know, you try to do something and you think it's going to be simple. This was such a performance to make this, I can't tell you. So you put the helium balloons in, and then they all sort of go strange and make the strange shape. So we actually had to fill them with helium when they were inside the tulle bag. So with everything that you do, there's also always a process. this next photograph of this hat, also from Matty Boven, who's a young English designer. This was made from quilted plastic, funnily enough, for Coach. And this next hat, these are masks made from Fresnel lenses, which are plastic and make the girls look wonderfully weird. You know, we don't always want to make people look pretty. Sometimes we want to make them look interesting as well, but that's me channeling my inner goth. I work with Tom Brown, this is one of his suits, and I work with him in New York. He's New York men's designer, and this is, you know, a bunny boy as opposed to a bunny girl, and made all sorts of different hats for him. When I'm starting to work with a designer, you know, you have to come up with a new idea, a new methodology. And I thought, well, we should make hats which look like the clothes that they are wearing. But believe me, these hats took almost as long to make as the suits that they're wearing. And any of you who've made clothes for dolls will know how difficult it is to suddenly miniaturize everything and to try and get a perfect finish. And this was another one which was the same silhouette as the dress that she was wearing, a full skirt. This made in straw. The next hat is one I got into huge trouble for because it was a molten ice cream. But, you know, the papers went nuts over this, of course. But it was quite beautifully made. And actually, the ice cream cone is made from straw, and that's all embroidered satin. This is another one for Tom Brown. This was for the men's show. These are two guys wearing this, and they were extras. So, you know, sometimes we make things for real life, but sometimes we make things for fantasy as well. And this was last week. These were hats as popsicle sticks. These are little boaters on candy canes. And also in New York, the week before last, I worked on the Fenty, the Rihanna's show. And I worked on this with Vicky Sarge. She did the jewelry for this. And the wonderful thing, it was all races or sizes or shapes. And it was really, really diverse and inclusive. And it was nothing about tokenism. She really went all the way, and it was also, in a way, the future of fashion. You know, there were no photographs of it, and these were all sent, the images were sent out to Amazon Prime customers in 80 countries. I've worked with Marc Jacobs for many, many years now, and this is a series of hats that I've made for him. He's always one of the big stars of New York Fashion Week, and this was a year ago, and the next slide is of the week before last. So these hats are hot off the catwalk. And the next one, which is this wonderful froggy little hairdo. And Adut, who's the model in this, absolutely adored it. But of course, these are big fashion shows, but I also work with private clients from my little shop in London and make hats to suit them. And of course, because I started to work with Boy George, I have a real celebrity clientele as well. So there was Pink, and then there's Madonna. This is a hat I made for her a long time ago. And this is Lady Gaga she was naked in this, and Katy Perry. Of course, when you have a hat that big, you don't really need to wear clothes as well. But you know, often when I'm making a hat for a famous person, it's really no different to making a hat for sort of a normal person. You know, the great thing about hats is they're so completely transformative. You know, every women's magazine or website says to people, oh, you know, be who you really are. You know, try and do some things which reflect the real you. I have to say that most people I know and most people I make hats for know exactly who they are, and occasionally would like to be somebody else. And the great thing about a hat is you can put the hat on and become somebody else. So, for example, in the next picture, you will see Sophie and Bette Midler, and, you know, underneath the makeup, underneath the hairdo, underneath the great hat, they're just normal people. But if you put all that almost drag on, then they can become stars. These are some of the hats that I made for the Met Ball Gala, which is at the Museum of Modern Art at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And as well as, the next picture coming up, this was extraordinary. This particular one for Cardi B. I fitted her. She was coming in by plane. I think she'd been doing a show in Indianapolis, and she was coming in by private plane. So we were waiting there in the fitting the night before the show. She was coming in at 2 o'clock, coming in at 3 o'clock, coming in at 4 o'clock. And eventually she arrived and sat down, and the poor thing was so tired. She sat in a seat and immediately fell asleep. And I had to fit this balaclava on her. And she was actually asleep when I was doing it. How I didn't stab her with a pin, I'm not quite sure, but anyway, I saw her afterwards and she said, "Did that all just happen?" And then hats for the royal wedding. This was, I loved in the newspapers, it was Amal Clooney and her husband. And that's how they call it, but she's gorgeous and, wonderful, and an international lawyer, and he's charming as well. And I have to say, one of the most extraordinary moments of my life when I was, the night before the wedding, I had to go down and make a few alterations. And I was sitting down and he came in and he said, "Are you hungry?" And I said, "Yeah, a bit." And it was quite extraordinary to have George Clooney making you a sandwich and saying, "Do you want mustard or mayonnaise in it?" It was quite surreal. And I should have kept a piece of the sandwich, but actually I was so hungry I ate the whole thing. You should have kept it in a box, like Elvis's forelock or something. Anyway, moving on to the next one. This is Kate Moss at the Met Ball a few years ago. But yes, it is exciting to work with celebrities. And I've worked with so many different ones throughout the years. Singers, of course, because the great thing is that when you change your hat, they completely change their look. So if they've got a new album or a new thing coming out, they can be very, very quick and suddenly conjure up a new you. This, for example, was Nicole Kidman when she went to the races in Melbourne. This hat and this dress was all made out of recycled materials. Actually, the hat's made from Tyvek, recycled Tyvek, and building materials. And this is Emily Blunt that I made a hat for for the Met Ball this year. And this was Julianne Moore as well. So lots of famous people. And I've just realized in the next picture, I'm wearing the same suit. So it is me. And then here's Rihanna again, looking gorgeous on the cover of Harper's, and Elle Fanning in Cannes, wearing a Dior hat in straw, and Lil Nas, love him, and Tilda Swinton wearing a Busby. So the great thing, Tilda, who is the most chic person in the entire world, and this is Celine Dion at the fashion shows last year, and Billy Porter last week, I think it was last week, at the Emmys, and very proud. And we made him this hat, and he never actually had a fitting, and I was just praying that it would fit and it would work. Because, when you're a designer, you always hope you know, but you never really know. And sometimes when I take a hat out of my boxes, I don't know if the person's going to like it. I have no idea whatsoever. And this was Liv Tyler, and to end up on sort of celebrity hats, this is, of course, Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. But I really wanted to share with you a little bit my process of how I work. I make a hat, even though I work for other people and work for celebrities, blah, 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 I make a collection every 6 months. And each time it has a theme. So, for example, I did this. I visited Berlin and I went to the Bauhaus Museum, and I thought, well, I'll do a collection about the Bauhaus. And in fact, there's some hats here. These 2 hats on the far side are from that collection. But I realized that, in fact, I'd been to art school too. And this is wonderful pictures of famous architects wearing hats, because, architecture and hats are very, very closely related. Basically, a hat is architecture that you put on your head. and vice versa. And this is the Bauhaus when they had a hat project in the 1930s. And I decided to make, this is tragic ballet, and I decided to make a hat collection based on my experiences of art school. So, you know, here we had interview, registration, first project, critique, the Union Bar, theory, presentation, party, friends. My favorite one is tutorial, because that's when your head sort of explodes, you see. All-nighter, fashion show, and then freedom at the end of it. And of course, all of you think, well, you're at college, and then you jump into the great abyss of what on earth am I going to do when I leave college? Because it's very great to be within these hallowed walls, and then you have to go and do your own thing. But these are some of the hats coming on to the next picture that are actually here. This is the one that I didn't turn on previously. I will do in a minute. This is interview. This was concept, which was this far one. This is all made out of steel wire. This was a Bauhaus toy that was made called Little Mascot, and that was the hat on the far side, and that became construction. And this is tutorial when your head explodes, when your tutors say that they hate your work. This is all-nighter. This is how you feel. Actually, not after the first all-nighter, but when you've done the second all-nighter, that's how your eyes definitely feel. And that was what you'll show, because whatever it is, it has to be fabulous. You know, it's, you know, what we do is about doing this, creating this thing, but it's also about selling it and performance. And then, of course, you have freedom at the end. I also did a collection. I came to Detroit a few years ago, and this was a, you can see it, I amended the photograph, and it's called Hatsville, USA. Sorry, if we go back one, you can see Hatsville, USA. And I'm doing a very, I'm certainly not the Temptation, actually. But growing up, I always loved Motown, and funny enough, these hats here inspired my trip to Detroit. This hat, the one just on the far side with the pink bow on it, is called Miss Ross. It's the photograph of it. Oops, sorry. And amazingly enough, I did some research, and she was in fact a milliner. She did millinery classes when she was about 16 and 17, and that actually paid for a rehearsal room for her in the Supremes. And the next picture is a little pillbox inspired by the embroidery on that picture earlier of her dress, and then, you know, being taken around by my friends and seeing the Guardian building in Detroit. That's how we can use that. And then that became the trim on a hat, and this is out of cutout felt. If you go back one, you can actually see how that is really taking the design of the roof and then putting it onto a hat. So in a way, I do live my life and make a hat out of it. And then, of course, being here in this part of the world, extraordinarily enough, this was called Cadillac and had that glamour, and this was inspired. We're having to go very fast now because I'm running out of time. So these were all hats inspired by Detroit. This is the M35. This is made out of pleated satin ribbon, which looked like a cog. Then this, of course, a beautiful texture. And this is the hat there, and the hat that you see in front of you here, which is made out of embroidered metal, which was quite a feat to arrange. And this is graffiti, the graffiti scene in. And this is made out of cut felt. And this is from the Heidelberg project. And then I did my own version, which is over here. So we've got a mini in black satin and all sorts of different things in black satin. And this was Panic, because of course we panic in Detroit, like the song. But this is also how I work with designer collections. Not only my own collection, there's also a process. And this one is one that I did with Dior. And this was a collection from a few years ago inspired by the illustrator René Gruor. And he was a great friend of Monsieur Dior's. There's a little bit of text from him. They were really, really best friends. This is one of Gruor's drawings, I think from 1954. And so this was my interpretation of the hat that the lady was wearing in the previous slide. And this is a fitting photograph. And then this was my drawing with early fabric swatches on it. And then later fabric swatches when developing the idea. And this was the actual hat on the runway. And as well as all of this, I said my paper round. I don't think people have, shows you how old I am, because I don't think people have paper rounds nowadays. They just log on to the internet. But I work on exhibitions too. So I've had exhibitions in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And this was an anthology of hats that I prepared. These was actually Queen Victoria's and Prince Albert's hat in the center there, the first time they were brought together. This was the interior of the museum. If we just sort of quickly go through these, and you know, the world of hats is ever expanding. I do all sorts of different things, but you know, I never ever get used to it. Every day really is a surprise. And I think if you are a designer, you know, people always say to me, what's your favorite design? And I always say, the next one I'm going to do. Why I have this insatiable ability and desire to create something new, I don't really know. Funnily enough, when I go on holiday and I'm with friends, they always say, oh, relax now, relax. And I'm secretly with a pad of paper and a pencil sketching away. Oh, this was me installing the Anubis head mask at the V&A in London. And I work with Metropolitan Museum in New York, and I have worked for many seasons on many different exhibitions. First there was Anglomania, and then these are sort of different hats that I made as a part of the display. This is China Through the Looking Glass from a few years ago. And the exhibition, which is just closed now, a couple of weeks ago, which was Camp, I made the hat which was in the poster. And this is a few photographs of the inside of the exhibition. And there was a hat on every single mannequin. Often if you're displaying things in a museum, if you just have a bald head like mine, it's a bit of a point of view. But if you have a hat, it can really understand the message. And this is something which is local. Sandy Schreier, local girl made good on her way to New York, and she is a local collector, has one of the greatest collections of costume in the United States, and there's an exhibition on her which is happening in November of this year. These are some of the clothes that she's going to be exhibiting, and some of the sketches that I'm going to be hats that I'm creating especially for this. But I've had exhibitions around the world. This is one coming on now, an exhibition I had in St. Louis, which was hats of mine inspired by paintings, and it was a huge honor to have my hats displayed next to these particular paintings. And we just closed an exhibition in Brighton in the south of England, which was Stephen Jones' hats. Here this is this extraordinary Orientalist palace, which was created in the 18th century. This was the banqueting room. I created a banquet for sort of all my friends. This was the kitchen. Lots of different hats here. You can see hats like a colander, and this was onion soup, and a knitted hat. You can see this one here is a little bit like a face. It's a knitted English breakfast. And then exhibitions in Momu and Antwerp in different languages. And this is the interior with giant hats that I made. Running through pictures now. So many hats. What's this one? Oh, this is Dover 3. Oh, well, the great thing about a chair is you put it upside down and suddenly you have 4 display stands. So that's a very convenient one. Special projects, I work on films too. This is Elizabeth the Golden Age, Coco Avant Chanel, and as we can see, Keira Knightley. And when you're working on a film, you know, this one tiny scene that you're doing is maybe going to be 20 yards across on a huge cinema. So details are so important. A film which has just come out, well, just last year came out, is Eternity's Gate with William Dafoe, and we made this wonderful hat for him. Actually, to meet him and meet him as a star was extraordinary. He's one of my sort of big heroes. And going through. This is different hats and different commercial projects I've done. This is for British Airways. This is for Perrier, made out of cast resin. This is for the closing of the Olympics. I'm really having to race now. I'm being told to wind up very quickly. But of course, those of you who want to ask me questions, oh, and this was a hat for an equestrian statue. Those who want to ask me some questions, I'm going to be just next door, and I'll take your questions. But that's everything from me now. Thank you.